Old school long division before calculators. Going to divide 32 into 68,450. To divide, just divide 32 into 68. When you divide 32 into 68, it goes in there 2 times. Once you get that number up top, multiply back. Take 2 times 32, that is 64. After you multiply back, then you subtract. You're subtracting 68 minus 64, that is 4. After you subtract, bring down the next digit. Bring down that 4. And then you're going to divide 32 into 44. So 32 goes into 44 1 time. Put that number up top and then multiply back. Take 1 times 32, that is 32. And after you multiply back, then you're subtracting. 44 minus 32, that is 12. After you subtract, again, bring down the next digit. So you're bringing down that 5. When you bring down that 5, then you're dividing 32 into 125. 32 goes into 125 3 times. Put that number up top and then multiply back. Take 3 times 32, that is 96. After you multiply back, then you're subtracting again. 125 minus 96, that is 29. And then you're bringing down the next digit, bringing down that 0. So when you bring down that 0, then you're dividing again 32 into 290. 32 goes into 290 9 times. And then multiply back. 9 times 32, that is going to be 288. And then subtract again. You're going to be left with 2. Now you could take this further, you could get into decimals, or you could put that 2 over 32, because that is what we know as the remainder. So you could put 2 over 32, but that 2 over 32 reduces, and that reduces to 1/16. So 2,139 and 1/16 is what you get when you divide the good old days before calculators. We're dividing 2c squared plus c minus 2 by c plus 1. We're going to use long division, so set this up with long division. You're dividing by c plus 1, so put that on the outside, and then put 2c squared plus c minus 2 on the inside. Now you divide this just like you do with numbers with long division, except when you start dividing, you only divide the first term. So you're only dividing c into 2c squared. So just divide the first term c into 2c squared, or 2c squared divided by c. That is going to be 2c. Now, since you're dividing by 2 terms, write that over the second term. Once you get that term up top, just like long division with numbers, you multiply back. Take 2c times c plus 1 with the distributive property. So 2c times c plus 1, that is going to be 2c squared plus 2c. And just like with numbers, after you multiply back, then you subtract. Now watch your signs when you subtract. This is where the mistakes are made. So when you subtract, you're taking c minus 2c. So c minus 2c, that is negative c. And then 2c squared minus 2c squared, those just cancel each other out. Now remember, with numbers in long division, after you subtract, then you bring down the next term, or bring down the next number. So in this case, we're bringing down that negative 2. Then divide again. And when you divide, you're only dividing the first term. So you're dividing c into negative c. Or negative c divided by c, that is negative 1. So put that up top. Once you get that number or that term up top, then multiply back with the distributive property. So take negative 1 times c plus 1. With the distributive property, that is going to be negative c minus 1. Remember, after you multiply back, then you subtract. Watch your signs on the subtraction. This is where the mistakes will be made. When you subtract, this is not going to be negative 3. It's negative 2 minus a negative 1. So negative 2 minus a negative 1, that is negative 2 plus 1. And that is going to be negative 1. If you take negative c minus a negative c, that's just going to be 0. Those cancel each other out. So this is the remainder. Now we are dividing by c plus 1. That's the remainder. So put that minus 1 over c plus 1. And that is it. After you divide, you get 2c minus 1 over c plus 1. Dividing 3x to the third minus x squared minus 17x plus 9 by x minus 3. Once again, set this up with long division. Put the x minus 3 on the outside, and the 3x to the third minus x squared minus 17x plus 9 on the inside. When you divide, you're only dividing the first terms. So we're only dividing 3x to the third by x. If you divide 3x to the third by x, that is 3x squared. You're dividing by 2 terms, so just go over 2 terms, put that above. That keeps everything lined up. Once you get that number or that term up top, multiply back with the distributive property. 3x squared times x is 3x to the third, and 3x squared times negative 3, that is negative 9x squared. After you multiply back, then you subtract. Watch your signs on the subtraction. Negative x squared minus a negative 9x squared, there'd be negative x squared plus 9x squared, and that is 8x squared. 3x to the third minus 3x to the third, that's just 0. After you subtract, bring down that next term, so bring down that negative 17x. And after you bring down that next term, you're back to division. Only divide the first terms. You're only dividing x into 8x squared. If you divide 8x squared by x, that is 8x. Put that up top. And then multiply back with the distributive property. So we're taking 8x times x, that is 8x squared, and 8x times negative 3, that is negative 24x. Subtract, watch your signs. Negative 17x minus a negative 24x, that would be negative 17x plus 24x, and that is 7x. 8x squared minus 8x squared is just 0. So we have 7x. We still have another term to bring down. Bring that next term down. Bring the 9 down. We're dividing x into 7x. Only divide the first terms. Only divide x into 7x. That would be 7. Put that up top. And then multiply back with the distributive property. Take 7 times x minus 3. It's going to be 7x minus 21. And then when you subtract, watch your signs. 9 minus a negative 21 is going to be 9 plus 21, and that is 30. That's the remainder. There's nothing else to bring down. That's the remainder, so we're going to put that over x minus 3. So it's 3x squared plus 8x plus 7 plus 30 over x minus 3. We're going to divide 15 minus 14n plus 8n squared by 4n minus 5, but we have a little situation here. These terms are not in decreasing order of the exponents. So we want to rearrange those terms, put those in decreasing order of the exponents before we divide. So put the 8n squared out front, then it's minus 14n plus 15. We're still dividing by 4n minus 5. So set this up with long division, put the 4n minus 5 on the outside, and the 8n squared minus 14n plus 15 on the inside. When you start the division, you're only dividing the first term. So you're just dividing 8n squared by 4n. When you divide 8n squared by 4n, that is 2n. Put that up top, and then multiply back with the distributive property. So take 2n times 4n, that is 8n squared, and 2n times negative 5, that is negative 10n. Then subtract. You're taking negative 14n minus a negative 10n, that would be negative 14n plus 10n, and that is negative 4n. After you subtract, bring down the next term. So bring down that 15. And then you're dividing again. You're dividing 4n into negative 4n. So just divide the first terms. Negative 4n divided by 4n, that is negative 1. Put that up top. After you put that number up top, multiply back with the distributive property. Multiply negative 1 by 4n minus 5 with the distributive property. That is negative 4n plus 5. After you multiply back, then you're subtracting again. So you're subtracting 15 minus 5, and that is 10. That is the remainder because there's nothing else to bring down. So you're going to take that remainder of 10 and put that over 4n minus 5. So when you divide, you get 2n minus 1 plus 10 over 4n minus 5. Dividing a to the third minus 13a minus 12 by a plus 3. But this one's a little different because notice we're skipping a term. Where's the a squared term? You're jumping from a to the third to a. So what you have to do in this situation is you have to fill in with a 0a squared. We need to have that there as a placeholder. So put a 0a squared in. Now we're dividing a to the third plus 0a squared minus 13a minus 12 by a plus 3. So set this up with long division. Put the a plus 3 on the outside, and that a to the third plus 0a squared minus 13a minus 12 on the inside. Proceed with long division. Just divide the first terms to start. You're dividing a to the third by a. When you divide a to the third by a, that is a squared. Put that up top over the second term because you have two terms out here. Just go over two terms, and that's what you're lining it up with. Once you get that number, that term up top, multiply back with the distributive property. So multiply a squared by a plus 3 with the distributive property. Get a to the third plus 3a squared. Next step is to subtract, but watch your signs when you subtract. This is not going to be 3a squared. It's 0a squared minus 3a squared, and that is negative 3a squared. A to the third minus a to the third, that's just 0. After you subtract, then bring down the next term, so you're bringing down that negative 13a. And then again, divide only the first terms. So you're just dividing negative 3a squared by a. When you divide negative 3a squared by a, that is negative 3a. Put that up top. Once you get that term up top, multiply back with the distributive property. So take negative 3a times a plus 3. That is going to be negative 3a squared minus 9a. Next step is to subtract, but watch your signs. A lot of people would have negative 22a here. That's not right. That would be adding. We want to subtract negative 13a minus a negative 9a. That'd be negative 13a plus 9a, and that is negative 4a. Next step is to bring down that negative 12. So bring down the next term, and then you're back to division. Divide only the first terms. You're dividing negative 4a by a. So if you divide negative 4a by a, that is negative 4. Put that up top. And then multiply back with the distributive property. Multiply negative 4 by a plus 3, and that is going to be negative 4a minus 12. If you subtract, those two things are the same. So when you subtract, it's just going to be 0. In other words, there is no remainder. So when you divide, final answer is a squared minus 3a minus 4. We're going to divide 6x to the third plus 4x squared minus 3x minus 8 by 2x squared minus 1. But we are missing a term. You're jumping from 2x squared to the constant term. Whenever you're missing a term, whenever you skip over a term, and whether it's what you're dividing or what you're dividing by, you have to fill in with a 0 as a placeholder. So we're jumping from 2x squared to that minus 1. We need to fill in with the 0x. Now you can set that up with long division. Put the 2x squared plus 0x minus 1 on the outside, and the 6x to the third plus 4x squared minus 3x minus 8 on the inside. Yes, we are now dividing by 3 terms instead of just 2, but you treat it the same way. You start by just dividing the first terms. You're dividing 2x squared into 6x to the third. You're dividing 6x to the third by 2x squared. That is going to be 3x. Now, you're dividing by 3 terms, so count over 3 terms, put that up above. That keeps everything lined up. Once you get that term up top, then you multiply back with the distributive property. So taking 3x times 2x squared, that is 6x to the third. 3x times 0x, that is 0x squared, and 3x times negative 1, that is negative 3x. After you multiply back, subtract. Watch your signs. Take negative 3x minus a negative 3x, that's going to be 0. But you want to put a 0x in there as a placeholder. And then 4x squared minus 0x squared, that is 4x squared. And finally, 6x to the third minus 6x to the third, it's just going to be 0. So after you subtract, bring down that next term. So you're bringing down that minus 8. Then you're dividing again. When you divide, you only divide the first term. So you're dividing 4x squared by 2x squared. 4x squared divided by 2x squared, that is 2. Put that up top. After you put that term up top, multiply back with the distributive property. So take 2 times 2x squared, that is 4x squared. 2 times 0x, that is 0x. And 2 times negative 1, that is negative 2. After you multiply back, then subtract. Watch your signs. Negative 8 minus a negative 2. That'd be negative 8 plus 2, and that is negative 6. 0x minus 0x is just 0, and 4x squared minus 4x squared is 0. We don't need to put anything in. There's nothing left to bring down. That's the remainder. Now, since that's the remainder, we're going to put that minus 6 over what we started dividing by. We don't need to have the 0x in there, but what we started dividing by is what was that 2x squared minus 1. So the final answer here is 3x plus 2 minus 6, that remainder, over 2x squared minus 1. We're dividing a to the third plus 1 by a plus 1. We're missing a couple terms here. You're jumping from a to the third to that constant term of 1. So you're missing an a squared term. You're also missing an a term. So we're going to fill in with a 0a squared and a 0a. You have to put those in as placeholders for this to work. So we're dividing by a plus 1. That a plus 1 goes on the outside. And we're dividing a to the third plus 0a squared plus 0a plus 1. Put that on the inside. Now when you divide, start by dividing just the first terms. You're only dividing a into a to the third. Or a to the third divided by a, that is a squared. Put that up top. Once you put that term up top, multiply back with the distributive property. So a squared times a is a to the third. And a squared times 1, that is a squared. After you multiply back, then subtract. So you're subtracting 0a squared minus a squared. Watch your signs. It's going to be negative a squared. A to the third minus a to the third, that's just 0. After you subtract, bring down that next term. So you're bringing down that 0. 0a. Then divide a into negative a squared. So just divide the first terms. Negative a squared divided by a, that would be negative a. Put that up top. And then multiply back with the distributive property. So take negative a times a, that is negative a squared, and negative a times 1, that is negative a. After you multiply back with the distributive property, subtract. But watch your signs every time you subtract. 0a minus a negative a, that is 0a plus a, and that is going to be a. Negative a squared minus the negative a squared, it's just negative a squared plus a squared, that's 0. Or if those two are the same, you can see when you subtract, that's going to be 0. Bring down that 1, and we'll finish this off. So bring down the 1, and then you're back to dividing. Now notice they are the same thing. You're dividing a plus 1 really into a plus 1, or dividing a into a to start with, but that's just going to be 1. And then multiply back with the distributive property, there's going to be no remainder because they were the same thing when you divided. So if you subtract there is no remainder. A squared minus a plus 1 is the final answer. Again, the good old days without calculators.